So, as I mentioned by the end of the last lecture, in this one we will now make the bookmarks data persist across page loads. And for that, we're going to use local storage. And once again, this will now become quite easy and quite straightforward because we already have our entire project structure so nicely set up. So, storing data in local storage is of course all about data. And so that will have to be implemented here in the model. So let's actually take a look here at our flowchart again. And so now this is all about loading bookmarks from local storage and storing bookmarks to local storage. So when should the bookmarks be stored to local storage? Well, that happens whenever the user bookmarks a recipe. And of course, also when the user unbookmarks the recipe. So in either of these cases, the current bookmarks array basically needs to be stored to local storage. Okay, so what I just said is that whenever we add a bookmark or delete a bookmark, we need to persist that data. And so let's add a function here, which we can then call in these two functions. So this one we don't need to export because we simply will call it in these other two functions. So persist bookmarks. And then here, remember, all we have to do is local storage dot set item. Then here we can give that item a name. So that's bookmarks. And then here we need to set a string. And we do that by calling json.stringify and then with the object that we basically want to convert to a string. And so that is state.bookmarks. And that's actually it. Now all we have to do is to call this function in these two places. And that's already the first step. And we can actually try that out already. So at least seeing it in the console. So let's bookmark this one and also this Greek pasta salad. Right? So both of them are now here. And let's come here to application and then local storage. And so here it is already. So here are the bookmarks with these two recipes that we just stored. And now as I reload the page, you see that the data is still here. Now, of course, it is not yet back here. So just because the data is still in local storage doesn't mean that it's magically gonna show up here, because we didn't write any code for that yet. But let's now actually go do that. So basically, when the page is loaded, we then want to run a method which will basically render the bookmarks here. All right. So the first step in doing that is to actually get the bookmarks out of the local storage and back into our code. And then after that, we can then, as I just said, render them back here to this bookmarks view. Okay. So we have the code for persisting, so for storing the bookmarks in local storage here. So let's now also have the code for taking them out, also right here. And let me simply write an initialization function here. So an init function, and then right at the beginning, I will call that init function. And here, of course, missing the function keyword. And so here we need to do the opposite. So local storage dot get item, and then remember it is called bookmarks. And then we also need to store that somewhere. And I'm not storing it directly into our state because this data might not be defined actually. So we might have nothing, of course, in the storage. And so only if there is storage, then we want state dot bookmarks to be JSON dot parse, which is basically to convert the string back to an object. And so here we are now calling this function right in the beginning, and then just to see, let's then immediately log state dot bookmarks to the console. Okay, so here we have a lot of logs. So let's go here to line 11 of these two and line 114 of the model. So model, now this one actually is the one that I just did, but here we apparently have some console.logs that we don't need. So here and here. And in fact, let's close these here. And actually all of them for now. And so here, right immediately, we have the local storage. Now, for some reason, this recipe was not found. Let's reload. Well, that's weird. And apparently, we broke something in our code. But let's worry about that in a second. So for now, what matters here is that we actually got the data back from local storage. So let's see if this has anything to do with the code that we just wrote here. Well, that's very weird. So now it is back to working for some reason. So let's actually log the error that is actually happening to the console. So here, let's set that back to cause that error. But then here in the controller, so the one that is responsible for loading the recipe. So here right now, we are only rendering the error to the user interface. And we are doing that with this nicely formatted error that we defined in the recipe view. But so let's now actually also log the error itself in the console so that we can see what is actually happening. So console.error with error. And so now we get text content of undefined coming from controller at line 34. Okay, that's just the log. And so here we have the stack trace. And so the error itself is originating in line 25. So it is here when we update the bookmarks view. Okay, so this is where the error basically comes from. And so this is how we use this so-called stack trace. So here we can then follow exactly what happens. So here we then need to go to view 27, which is where this update is defined, then for each, and then line 37. So line 37 in the view. And so that is right here. So some kind of problem with updating the bookmarks view. So apparently we're trying to set the text content on some element here that doesn't yet exist. So maybe we are simply calling this method here a little bit too soon. So let's move that here to the end. So updating bookmarks view. So we still have an error. So this might be a good time to use the debugger. And I hope that with this, we will be able to find the bug. And if you're not interested in watching me find this bug, then please feel free to jump to some later point in the code. So you see that at this point, the recipe has actually loaded. Okay. And so now here we are at the debugger. And so let's now go to the next step, which is this one here. Then we go into bookmarks view.update. And at this point, the data here is actually already the data that is coming from our local storage, right? So this bookmarks here is at this point already loaded. So right here, we do that right at the beginning. And so therefore, the bookmarks, so model.state.bookmarks, here is already defined. So that's these two objects right there. Let's actually see the scope here. And so indeed, that's these two recipe objects, right? So here we also have the entire call stack. Okay. And now let's keep going. So the new markup, then here we go through all of this. Okay. Once again. All right. So here we are back. Whoa, what's that? Ah, so I just hovered over the string, which is all of this. So that's this markup that we just generated. Then here, let's generate this DOM. Okay. Then here, the new elements and the current elements. So right now, here inside the current elements, let's see what that is. So that's all of the elements that are basically right now in that empty bookmarks panel, right? Now, and you see that the length of this one here is 5, and this one here is 14. And so I think I'm starting to see the problem here. So these two arrays are the arrays that we are basically comparing here, right? So we have this whole for each loop to compare the elements in these two arrays, right? Because the goal of this method is to not add new elements, but only to replace some text in elements that already exist. However, right now this bookmarks here is still empty, and what this update here is trying to do is to now insert the data in there. And so that should not happen. Okay? And so I'll actually quit this now by going back here, getting rid of this, and simply reloading. So let's get this down. And so in order to prevent this, the first thing that we need to do now on the page is basically render the bookmarks. And remember, that should happen right at the beginning when we load the page. So let's go to the bookmarks view and here create a new handler. So add handler render, which receives an handler, and then window.add event listener and load. And then we will immediately call this handler. Okay. And so here, we already imported it. And so here at the very end, let's create then the handler function. So the controller control bookmarks. And then all that we will do is actually take bookmarks view dot render with state dot bookmarks. And again, that is actually model dot state. And now let's, as the first of all thing here, do bookmarks view dot add handler render with the control bookmarks. And so now we are back to working, and the two bookmarks from before are now actually here. All right, so with that we solved the problem. Because now, as the page here tries to then updating the bookmarks view, the bookmarks are already there. And so then there's nothing to update really. So we can actually move that back up here, I believe. Actually, this one as well. So let's try that again. And yeah, so this is a bit of a more natural order. Okay. And so now, of course, I can click here and then this gets selected and everything keeps working the same. So we don't even need to search functionality to be able to switch between our recipes. And of course, if we unbookmark, then that is gone. And as we reload the page, then we only have this one. Then let's remove all of them. And then as this was re-rendered, right, then we got this error message here back. And of course, if we reload now, then we have no bookmarks at all again. Now, just to finish, let's quickly add like a quick function here for debugging. So let's call it clear bookmarks, which is simply a function that at some point we might want to call, but again, only during development. So clear, then bookmarks. So when I'm working with this, then sometimes I need to do this. So clearing all the bookmarks. So let me add a couple of ones here. So this one and this one. Okay, and now as I reload the page, it should then clear all of them. Well, it didn't for some reason. Oh, and that's probably because this one here happened first. So let's take this one out, do that again, and now the bookmarks are gone. Okay, but by default, this will of course be turned off because otherwise our application is not going to work. So here is the hot pizza dip, and it is still bookmarked after we reload the application. And so let's quickly, to finish, check out our flowchart, but I'm pretty confident that everything is implemented. So when the user clicks a bookmark, it will then mark the selected bookmark here, and of course it will render the recipe. When the page loads, then the bookmarks are loaded from local storage and they are rendered. So check here as well. And when the user bookmarks a recipe, then it gets stored to local storage. So check here as well. And so we just implemented all of this, a rather complex part. So now it's finally time to take a break and take an overview of what we need to implement next in order to finish this application.